How much did your mother leave you? Eric asked me bluntly, right after my mother's funeral. I was shocked that he could say something like that without even a word of sympathy. He must have thought that the inheritance was already in my account because he saw me with a bank book. But to say something like that right after her funeral, it was just wrong, both as a person and as my husband. It's about $4 million, I replied. $4 million? That's it, Eric said, with a smirk that made me feel uneasy. Even though I knew that after taxes there would still be hundreds of thousands left, I didn't like the way he reacted. His smile was nasty, and it made me very uncomfortable. I didn't know what he was planning, but I had a feeling that whatever it was, things wouldn't go the way he expected. The next day, Eric started putting his plan into action, but his shallow thinking was going to cost him everything. He just didn't know it yet. My name is Alice Taylor. I got married through an arranged marriage when I was 20. My husband's name is Eric, and he works for a company. He's 3 years older than me and the oldest son of the Owen family. But even though he's the oldest, his younger brother, Lars, left the house after graduating from university and hasn't been in touch since. So, Eric was treated like an only child and was very loved by his parents. Honestly, I didn't want to marry Eric. My mother came from a family that had been running a business for generations, and I was in a position where I couldn't go against what my parents decided. So, I ended up marrying Eric. He couldn't refuse the marriage either because his father was in business, and it was expected of him. We didn't marry out of love. It was a marriage far from happiness. Unfortunately, we couldn't have children. Since we got married young, it was hard to accept that we couldn't have kids, and I hoped that having a child would improve our situation. But even with visits to the hospital, it didn't happen. "Hey, barren woman, are the chores done?" my parents-in-law would say. At first, they treated me well as a young lady, but after a few years, they started calling me a barren woman. My father-in-law would say mean things every day like, "You should be able to make it happen if you just do what you're supposed to do. It's a waste of money going to the hospital." Eric never stood up for me while I was being scolded. He would either read the newspaper or take a nap, snoring away. Even when I wanted to change my life and said I wanted to work, he would say, "If you go to work, people will think we're not doing well," and wouldn't let me leave the house. At that time, it was common for women to become homemakers after getting married. But living with just my mother-in-law was honestly a nightmare. Every day was a struggle, and no one helped me. I couldn't tell my parents because I didn't want to worry them, and I couldn't run away because our marriage was tied to business. Still, I thought I would be rewarded someday and desperately endured each day. However, no matter how many years passed, the situation never got better. 19 years after our marriage, when I turned 44, my father-in-law died in an accident. That incident led to the discovery that his company had been avoiding taxes. The back taxes and fines depleted our assets, our property was seized, and the company went bankrupt. Although we kept the house, we had to let go of our comfortable lifestyle. I thought it would be hard for Eric, who was then 46, to find a new job, but my parents introduced him to one. Thanks to that, he quickly found work, but my mother-in-law became like an empty shell and aged rapidly. For a while, she didn't even have the energy to say mean things to me, which was a relief. But then she had a stroke and needed care. With this, I truly lost any hope of having a child. I was already 44 and had somewhat given up in my heart, but this became the real turning point for letting go. Eric, as if it were only natural, pushed the care of his mother onto me. On his days off, he would lounge around just like before. "Eric, I wish you'd help with your mother's care sometimes." I gathered my courage and told him one day. Even if it were just on his days off or even for one meal, if he could help, it would mean so much to me. But Eric frowned and said, "Huh? I'm working, you know. Let me rest on my days off." Eric just didn't seem to understand. I didn't really have what you would call a day off. After Eric's father's company went bankrupt, my parents started worrying about me. They finally said, "Come back home." But what would happen to his mother if I left now? We have a caretaker who comes once a week, but I can't imagine having the money to hire someone every day for this house. Even though I was treated badly, I couldn't abandon her. I just couldn't bring myself to leave. Over time, Eric started leaving the house early. even on his days off. He said he felt too uncomfortable to relax at home. I heard from the neighbors that he was telling people, "My wife won't even let me rest on my days off." He began taking trips by himself, even though everyone knew his mother needed care. It was clear that he didn't care what others thought of him, leaving all the caregiving to me. It was sad to see his mother, who had always loved Eric, being ignored by him now that she was sick. Sometimes, she would say to me, "It's because you're here that Eric won't come." But when I asked, "Should I leave then?" she would quickly fall silent. This went on for another 20 years, and the long period of caregiving finally ended when my mother-in-law passed away and reunited with her husband. I was about to turn 60 by then. By this time, I had no love left for Eric, but I had come to terms with a lot of things. Leaving didn't seem possible, and I figured I would probably spend the rest of my days in this house. Eric was diligent only when it came to his work, and even after reaching retirement age, he was asked to stay on as senior staff. This allowed us to live comfortably, and for that, I was grateful. Although our marriage wasn't good, Eric never tried to kick me out. He probably thought it was too late for that now. He still preferred being out of the house on his days off, so I began to enjoy my alone time. I even took up pottery as a hobby. For the first time since getting married, I made friends and started enjoying my life. But this seemed to annoy Eric. "You're out playing while I'm working," he said, and one day, he even burned my bag. I used the bag for my pottery class, and Eric set it on fire in the yard. "What are you doing? Don't get lost in weird hobbies, just do the housework," he scolded. My pottery materials and my pouch were still inside the bag, and even though I tried pouring water on it, it was too late. Everything turned to ashes. I was furious. I thought it was too late for change, but I realized I still had a long life ahead of me. The word divorce crossed my mind. But just as I was considering it, another misfortune struck. My parents suddenly passed away. My father died suddenly from an illness, and just a month after his funeral, my mother also fell ill and passed away. Everything happened so fast, and I was overwhelmed with sorrow. My brother Magnus had already taken over my father's company, and with so many people at both my father's and then my mother's funerals, I ended up bedridden for about a week afterward. It must have been mental exhaustion. My friends from the pottery class were kind enough to check on me, but Eric mocked me, saying, "How long are you going to sleep?" I was tired after Mom's funeral too, but I didn't sleep that much. It must be nice to sleep all you want without working. Maybe he had a point, but as a husband, his words were really hurtful. The next day, I forced myself to get up and return to my daily routine. I didn't have the luxury to enjoy my hobbies anymore. It was just the bare minimum of living. But Eric seemed satisfied and didn't care about how I felt. Then, sometime after my mother's funeral, I remembered that the payment deadline to the funeral home was approaching. I looked at the bank book since Magnus was busy with work, and I had promised to make the payment on his behalf. But Eric saw me with the bank book and came over with a sleazy smile. "So, how much was your mother's inheritance?" he asked. I was shocked by his words. He said this right after my mother's funeral, without a single word of concern for me. He must have thought the inheritance had already been deposited because he saw me with the bank book. But surely, that's unthinkable for a decent human being. I answered dully, "About $4 million. $4 million? That's it?" he said, smirking with an unpleasant smile. "Well, even after taxes, there should be hundreds of thousands left." His awful smile made me uneasy. I didn't know what Eric was thinking, but I was sure things wouldn't go his way. Without saying anything to him, I quietly put away the bank book. Finally noticing my mood, Eric spoke up. "Well, you've had it tough. You should rest early today." It was unusual for Eric to say anything kind, but instead of making me happy, his words made me feel sick. I didn't want to see Eric's face anymore, so I went to bed early that night. But something unexpected happened the next day. After breakfast, Eric left for work like he usually did. Later, I got a call from his workplace, saying he hadn't shown up. I was shocked because Eric had never missed work before. Worried that something might have happened, like an accident, I quickly tried to call him, but I couldn't get through. My heart raced as I paced around the house, wondering what could have gone wrong. As I walked into the living room, I saw something that made everything clear. On the living room table was a piece of paper. It was a divorce form, already filled out by Eric. The moment I saw it, I felt my stomach drop. No way, I thought to myself. I quickly checked the place where I had put the bankbook the day before. Just as I feared, the bankbook was gone. Unbelievable, I muttered. It wasn't an accident after all. Eric had likely left on his own, planning to disappear from my life. It all made sense now. That morning, when he was acting strangely, he must have taken the bankbook with plans to start a new life without me. He hadn't driven me out before because he was waiting for my parents' inheritance. The missing bankbook was proof enough of his intentions. But instead of panicking, I stayed calm. I knew there was no need to rush. Slowly, I filled out my part of the divorce form and took it to the city office. Eric had sown the seeds of his own downfall, and I decided he needed to fully understand that it was too late for regrets. I contacted Eric's workplace and calmly said, I can't reach him either, but it doesn't seem like an accident. I'll let you know as soon as I get in touch. Sorry for the inconvenience. They told me they would treat it as a paid leave day and wished him well. I couldn't help but feel a little envious of Eric for having such a supportive workplace, especially since it was a company introduced by my parents. I hoped he would be sincere towards his job, but now he was going to be a stranger to me. Submitting the divorce form went smoothly, and I was surprised at how easily I felt free after everything I had been through. It made me wonder if my life could have been different if I had divorced Eric earlier. As I started packing up my things, my phone rang. It was Eric. He hadn't answered any of my calls before, but now I knew exactly what he was going to say, so I ignored it and kept packing. The phone kept ringing over and over again. Eventually, even the house phone started ringing. I figured it was Eric, and it was so annoying that I reluctantly decided to answer it. Hello, I said casually. Sure enough, Eric's panicked voice came through the line. Yes, I called because I was informed you hadn't shown up for work. You should contact your workplace immediately, I said. That's not the issue right now. Eric interrupted me, shouting. I can't withdraw the money. Hearing his desperation, I couldn't help but burst out laughing. So he finally noticed, I thought. Eric must have been so eager to steal the bankbook that he didn't realize it was useless without the right paperwork. My ID, Eric stammered. You remember, don't you? Oh. Do you mean the one that was in the bag for my pottery class? I replied, still laughing. Eric sounded even more flustered. But this ID, it's expired. I chuckled. I wouldn't know. After your mother passed away, I repeatedly asked you to take care of the paperwork. I went to the bank to handle it, but they said it couldn't be done because I was in the air. So the bank book was left untouched, with just a few dollars remaining. Don't mess around. You should have organized everything properly for someone who's not here anymore, Eric shouted. I smiled to myself. You said you'd take care of it eventually, so keep that in mind. Don't blame me. Then what am I supposed to do with this bank book? Eric's voice was full of frustration. What to do or not to do? Unless you go to handle the paperwork, there's nothing that can be done about it, I said calmly. Eric kept complaining, but I didn't feel like responding anymore. I let the silence hang in the air, and he grew more impatient with each passing moment. Eric seemed desperate as he went back to the bank teller, trying to explain the situation. I accidentally burned the ID. Can't anything be done? Maybe by proxy? Look, I'm on the phone with my wife right now. It's urgent. He was speaking loudly, and I could hear the bank teller's troubled voice on the other end, clearly unsure about what to do. I decided to intervene. Eric, what are you talking about? You know you can't do anything like that as a stranger, right? I said, my voice calm but firm. Huh. Eric was caught off guard. I took a deep breath and delivered the final blow. The divorce papers were properly processed just now. Thanks for all the preparation. Bye. I hung up the phone, feeling a sense of closure. I was sure the bank teller had heard my last words too. By now, Eric was probably either pale with shock or red with anger. Just imagining his reaction made me laugh a little. I knew I needed to leave the house before he came back. With that thought in mind, I quickly packed my things and left. My destination was my family's old home, which had been empty since my parents passed away. I had inherited that house, along with some of my mother's assets from her successful business. Her total assets were worth about $30 million, but inheriting that much cash wouldn't have been safe if Eric found out, especially since we didn't have children. So I arranged to inherit just enough to live comfortably, around $4 million. The rest was the family home, my mother's beautifully preserved dresses, and my father's antiques. If those heirlooms were appraised, they would be worth a lot. My brother Magnus and I had discussed this arrangement peacefully. Magnus, who had moved out after getting married, was worried about the family home being vacant, so he was happy to inherit just the cash. He had children and had taken over our father's company, so this arrangement worked out well for both of us. After arriving at the family home, I called Magnus to tell him I had divorced Eric and would be living there from now on. If you're going to live in the family home, it won't be empty, which is a relief, Magnus said. But are you really okay with divorcing Eric, Alice? Yes, I replied without hesitation. We don't have children and both our parents have passed away. If we both want a divorce, then it's for the best. I want to restart my life, and I have no regrets. Magnus was worried about me being alone, but I reassured him. Living as Eric's servant for life would have been far worse. Besides, if I could spend the last moments of my life in this house, filled with memories of my family, even if I was alone, I would be happy. Eric kept calling me many times after that, but he didn't know I was staying at the family home and never came to visit. That day, I spent my time in peace, alone but relieved. The house felt lonely without a family, but I was finally free from the burden of my marriage. The next day, I finally gathered the energy to go make a deposit at the bank. The bank book was still with Eric, and I knew retrieving it would be troublesome. I decided to go around 5 a.m., assuming Eric would still be asleep. But when I got home and opened the front door, the smell of alcohol hit me hard. I couldn't help but grimace at the strong odor. Entering the living room, I saw beer cans scattered everywhere. My bank book was torn and left on the table in pieces. This is terrible, I muttered to myself. Tearing up someone's bank book like this, no matter how angry you are, is just wrong. I gathered up the pieces and put them in my bag, took a few clothes, and returned to my family home. Then I headed to the bank. As I approached the bank's entrance, I heard someone call out my name. Alice. It was Eric. He had been waiting for me. I noticed the bank book was gone, so I figured you'd come here, he said. Whether I come here or not is none of your business, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Don't say that. We've been together for so long, Eric pleaded. Even though the divorce was finalized, he still talked like we were a couple. I ignored him and entered the bank, determined not to let him get to me. Eric kept trying to talk to me, but I remained firm and ignored him. That's when something unexpected happened. Brother, isn't that Alice? A voice called out. It was Lars, Eric's younger brother. Both Eric and I were stunned to see him. We hardly ever saw Lars, usually only at funerals. It had been about 44 years since I had last seen him. Since I married Eric, this was probably only the third time I had met his brother, Lars. Lars had always wanted to cut ties with the family, but their parents had begged him to at least show up for important family events to protect the company's reputation. The last time we met was at my mother-in-law's funeral a few years ago, so he probably recognized us from that. I'm here for the inheritance of Mom's estate, Lars said, looking at both of us. Thought I'd check the balance and then inform you, too. Eric's eyes lit up with interest, and I was surprised as well. I thought there were just a few dollars left in the bank account, but according to Lars, there were also investment trusts and safe deposit boxes that had been set up a long time ago during their father's lifetime. Lars had heard about these from his mother before she passed away. She had sent him a message saying, "If anything happens, you take care of it." However, due to his busy life, it had taken Lars a while to act on this information. He looked apologetically at me and Eric. There was a letter in the safety deposit box along with some jewelry, Lars continued. Mom said all her estate should go to Alice. I was stunned by Lars's words, but Eric looked even more shocked. Lars pulled out a letter from the documents he had with him. I recognized the stationery immediately because I had bought it for my mother-in-law. The The letter clearly stated that all the jewelry in the safety deposit box and the other assets should go to me, her daughter-in-law, Alice. I could picture my mother-in-law writing it carefully. I remembered asking her if she needed help with any letters back then, but she had coldly replied, "It has nothing to do with you." Maybe she had meant to write this letter at that time. I covered my mouth in surprise. "Alice, you've been taking care of everything on your own, right?" Lars said. Despite the mean things my mother-in-law had said to me, she was sorry and wanted me to handle her estate. She knew that if she had told Eric, he would probably try to keep it all to himself. Next to me, Eric's face turned red, and he started trembling. Well, I never intended to inherit anything, but as the legal heir, I thought I had to handle it. It's just a matter of changing the name to Alice, so that shouldn't be a problem for you, right, Eric? Lars said this casually, not knowing about our divorce. Later, I was called to the bank counter to take care of the paperwork. Eric, now without any purpose, just sat in the lobby, lacking the energy to follow. That day, I completed the reissuance of the bank book and the transfer for the funeral home. "I'll be going ahead, Alice. I'll contact you again," Lars said, leaving Eric and me behind in the bank. I safely returned home, feeling a strange sense of closure. Lars contacted me again later, explaining that Eric had protested, saying, "Such a letter is invalid." But Lars had convinced him to respect their mother's wishes. However, unable to satisfy Eric, Lars visited a lawyer for free advice. Although the letter couldn't be recognized as an official will, the lawyer suggested that settling by discussion would be more cost-effective than hiring a lawyer. Eric reluctantly agreed to the inheritance arrangement, giving up on the investment trusts and jewelry since they weren't worth much. Thus, I formally received my mother-in-law's estate. If Alice gets Mom's estate, I should get it for my mother-in-law, right? Eric argued with the lawyer, but that was a separate matter. It was embarrassing, and even the lawyer scolded him. Eric couldn't accept it and eventually tracked me down at the family home, showing up at my doorstep. I was wrong. "Let's start over," he begged, realizing he couldn't get anything else. He knelt at the doorstep, pleading for reconciliation. Start over? There was never any love between us to begin with. What's there to start over? For the first time, I felt free to speak my mind. I shared my long-held feelings with Eric. He fell silent, seemingly regretting his actions for the first time, and I couldn't help but smile. "At least you still have the house, right? Have you contacted your workplace? If you're so desperate for money, you'd better work hard and not lose your job," I said firmly. Then I closed the door. It was finally over. The bank book held the assets left by our mothers, and with this, I could surely live comfortably from now on. Eric, however, continued to be absent from work without informing his workplace, which eventually led to his dismissal. I had warned him, but without even his passion for work, what was left for him? Maybe his hard work wasn't out of responsibility, but to maintain his dignity. Now, without anyone to show his dignity to and missing the easy money he thought he'd get, it wouldn't be surprising if he felt he had lost his purpose in life. Even though I was concerned for someone I had spent years with, that was it. I had no intention of helping him. Lars was the only one who apologized, saying, "I truly apologize for the trouble caused to you, Alice. It's really regrettable." He also told me that I no longer needed to deal with Eric. Realizing the family's issues early on, Lars had left home young and was probably living happily now without involving himself in that mess. Eric had become a recluse, but at his age, he could probably live on his pension. Wanting to start over showed he had some courage, at least, but he should try starting over on his own. I began attending pottery classes again, and my friends were delighted to see me back. I hadn't realized how enjoyable it could be to spend time just for myself. At the pottery class, I even met someone wonderful. Though I had sworn off marriage, I realized that being with someone who truly loves me might also be a form of happiness. Rather than being alone forever, it might be better to embrace new beginnings. It might feel too late, but just like with a divorce, it's never too late. As long as you're alive, anyone can find happiness, no matter their age. I believe that now.